Hello and welcome to Law and Democracy, a podcast of the Ohio State University program in election law. I am Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of the Election Law program here at OSU, and it's election day. And today, most of us are coming to you from the studios of WOSU here on the Ohio State campus. I'm delighted to be joined at the moment by my OSU colleagues, Terry Enns, sitting with me here, as well as Matt Cooper, part of the election law team here at Ohio State, and Ralph, also a member of our election law team, Tony Goggin, who is a very critical part of our team as a visitor here at Ohio State this year from the Drake University Law School. And there is a possibility that before we're finished today, that our director, Ned Foley, who is covering the election from the coast today, might also be able to participate in our discussion. We're excited to be able to talk about what's happening in the unfolding election today and what's on people's minds. Here we are in the afternoon on the East Coast of the 2024 election. What are we thinking about?
Well, I guess, Steve, the first thing that strikes me is that as we're broadcasting at a little after 3 p.m. Eastern on Election Day, over 80 million votes have been cast early, and tens of millions of ballots have been cast this morning and into the early afternoon. And it appears, at least as of now, that the election has proceeded extremely smoothly. There are about 158 million ballots cast in 2020. It looks at this moment like we might catch that number, maybe even surpass it. But whether we come a few million under, a few million over, my first impression is that this election is going far better than anyone could have hoped for in light of how passionate Americans are about this election outcome, the potential outcomes, and how divided the country has been for the last several election cycles. On this election day, Americans really have thus far united to have a peaceful, productive, constructive election day. So hopefully that will continue for the rest of this day.
So one of the things that I've been taking note of is that there are some long lines in some places. And indeed, when I voted early on Sunday, I was in a 2-hour line, and pretty much everyone seemed happy to be in that line. You know, I don't want to take for granted the fact that we are permitted to vote, and even if it takes some time and it takes some effort, you know, it's quite a privilege. And being in that line with all those folks was just kind of it was a cheerful thing.
I absolutely agree, Terry. I voted in person early this morning at an elementary school near my house. And the idea that, voters are coming together to exercise their right to vote is really, it's inspiring and it's exciting. And I was thinking as a lawyer about how this is one of the few times in a year when regular citizens engage with the law in terms of engage directly with the government. And I also think it's really interesting that we have other regular citizens who are out there administering the law, serving as precinct workers, determining who can vote regular ballots, who needs to vote a provisional ballot, whether ID is sufficient, et cetera. I mean, it's a really wonderful exercise in self-governance and in really demonstrating how the law is the people's.
One of the things that occurs to me as I'm just listening to what you've already said is election processes are quite complicated, and election day is a massive undertaking. And whether it's 150 or 160 or 165 million people, it's a huge number. And a very substantial part of that is happening today, even though a very substantial part of it has already happened. And it's all happening with the assistance of this cadre of tens of thousands of mainly volunteers who are recruited to perform a public service just today, uh, and under a variety of different conditions with quite a bit of fine grained differences between states. And in that context, you can never expect that election day will go off without any hitches at all. And today it hasn't. But I agree with Tony that it's gone quite smoothly. There are places where equipment wasn't working in the early morning hours, or there've been a little bit of, some issues about who can be observers and in what locations they can perform that role. Um, there's been at least one court order of which I've become aware so far that has extended the polling hours for a couple of hours because of equipment problems early in the day. Uh, but that level of election day issues is still quite small, given the scale of what we're doing, and quite manageable and quite common. I mean, we usually see a few things like that in any of our national elections. And so here we are charging now well into the afternoon, and I'm gratified that we haven't had major problems.
I'm trying to find some wood to knock on behalf of election administrators everywhere, Steve. And I think it's really fascinating to take a look at, election day and election season with early voting happening in other states, and thinking about when there are issues, how quickly courts are finding themselves able to needing to respond. We saw yesterday really quickly moving proceedings in Texas related to whether the DOJ could send election observers to polls in Texas. And so it's, you think about judges, attorneys, all being ready to move at a moment's notice on these important election changes, because this is a situation where time is incredibly of the essence. These aren't questions that can wait.
That makes me want to ask a question, which is, should we be having specialized election courts like we have some, there are specialized drug courts in some places and other places where there's sort of a subject matter expertise on the part of the judges. And given the speed and given the import of elections, should, we leave it to regular judges who do everything else as well. And so far that seems to work, but would it work differently or better if we had specialty courts?
That's such an interesting question, Terry. It makes me think about, what we might try to be helping along with specialty courts. Certainly, you could have expertise. You could have people who are sort of standing ready to move at a moment's notice and to decide things quickly. You would have clarity for the parties about where to bring these cases, and you could certainly eliminate, any impression that there's judge shopping going on based on the court where an individual decides to bring a case. I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore. I'd love to hear from Steve and Tony about whether anything like this has come up in the past.
Well, there have been occasions when, as part of some of our research projects here, we've thought about the role that a specialized election tribunal might play, even a limited one that might only handle a certain set of maybe post-election contests rather than the whole range of litigation about the mechanics of our elections. Uh, and there could well be some benefits of the kind that you've both been talking about. There's also a countervailing issue to think about, which is especially in the current moment in which there is a fairly high degree, or at least in my view, uh, unjustifiably high degree of skepticism about our election processes. Might some skeptics about the whole system feel that a specialized court is worse than the regular courts that they already know and have more familiarity with, and might see specialized courts as uh, just another piece of the way in which the electoral processes are being manipulated. I would worry a little about that.
It really does strike me that both federal and state courts in battleground states or states that in state elections are very hotly contested have in a way become election law experts. Certainly the federal courts have with regard to federal election law, and the state courts with regard to their pertinent state election rules and election laws and provisions. And the judicial system in general, I think, has gone through a sort of stress test. 2020, I think, was the ultimate stress test. And in a way, what's interesting is that 2024 hasn't put, at least in the last few weeks or as of mid-afternoon today, has not put the court system through the same sort of challenge as 2020 did. And I think that reflects in part the clarity that has been brought to so many aspects of election law, and the fact that the courts in 2020 really did play things fairly. I don't think there really could be an objective accusation that the courts were partisan in 2020. I think that the court system really performed admirably under extreme circumstances in the 2020 election. And so, while I think there's a lot to be said for considering establishing a specialized court, especially to hear challenges after an election, I think the court systems, federal and state in general, have really acquitted themselves extremely well. And it's something I think to be proud of as lawyers and law professors, that the system has worked.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a fair characterization of it.
Mhm. That
I
is an
think,
interesting.
yeah,
Oh,
go ahead,
sorry.
Matt.
That does seem like an interesting idea, the specialized courts, and it appears that the states would be free to experiment with those sorts of um, ideas, and there could be a lot of questions, of course, that would come up in terms of how the judges would be selected, and what exactly what cases would they be empowered to hear. But yeah, I do find that interesting, and um, yeah, if a state did go down that road and kind of what would happen. Um, but yeah, I do share Tony's view in terms of how the judges and the courts performed in 2020. Um, so yeah, and I wonder, well, they could be put to the test again this year, but maybe the more tests they pass, maybe there's less of a need for um, a more specialized court.
Going back to the smoothness of today so far, I think it was just a week ago on our podcast that Ned rightly observed how disturbing it was that a few drop boxes in Oregon and Washington had been the target of some firebombing. And that's just so antithetical to the notion of democratic elections. And today on election day, I know we are all a little bit cautious in hoping that nothing analogous occurs in a way that's, designed to mar this day of civic participation. And in that regard, there were in fact some bomb threats, as I understand it, in Georgia, threats to some voting locations today that I'm pretty sure were relatively quickly determined to be like false alarms and perhaps even the product of a foreign disinformation campaign just to frighten the American electorate about things. I just continue to really hope that this election and all future elections won't see any more of the kind of thing that we saw in those Dropbox firebombings a week ago. Of course, this is knock on wood, still the middle of the afternoon, but that's one thing I hope all of us as Americans can all be uh, hoping for and doing our best to discourage.
One thing I
And
heard a
it's
lot.
interesting.
Go ahead, Tony.
Oh, no, Ann, you go ahead.
One thing I heard a lot of this year, more so than I think in 2020 and 2022, was folks saying, I want to vote on election day because then I know it's not a provisional ballot. My vote, I will see that my vote has been, recorded and counted, as opposed to an absentee ballot in a drop box. I can feel more confident about it. And I feel like during the pandemic, that flexibility of absentee, early in person, although a drop boxes was really very, enhanced, I think, early participation. I'm wondering what we'll see going forward after those Dropbox incidents in particular. This is the first year I've heard that sort of flip side to early voting, is that with in-person voting, I feel more secure about a vote, which is just anecdotally.
Yeah, and it's interesting about that particular case, the arson attack in Washington. We here at Ohio State University's election law program, we are hosting a court watchers program with over 40 students, the Moritz College of Law, who are tracking election litigation and election issues over the course of the day. And one of our students did a presentation about an hour and a half ago to the whole group on the fact that the particular arson attack that happened about 2 weeks ago in southern Washington happened in a congressional district that was decided by 3,000 votes, and 2,000 ballots apparently were destroyed by the attack. And what's really remarkable to reflect on is most election analysts think the U.S. House, the majority control of the U.S. House, may come down to one or two races, which is extraordinary to think that we might end up with a 218, 217 divide in the U.S. House. And so that congressional district in southern Washington could end up being decisive in determining who's the Speaker of the House. But I think big picture, that also underscores how well this election has been run overall, in that in a country that's so deeply divided, the awful episode that happened 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago is thus far unique. And the vast majority of 99.99999% of ballots have not been affected by a terroristic act. So even though it's possible what happened 2 weeks ago could affect who the next speaker is, depending on how close the race is in southern Washington, it's still, in my view, when viewed in context, suggests that we really have an extremely well-run system of elections, both at the federal level and the state. Here we are in the middle afternoon on Tuesday. When you voted, did you have a sense of what the atmosphere was like among the people who were in line with you, or if you voted in person? Did you have a sense of excitement among the electorate? Do you have a sense of tension or anxiety? What were your takeaways?
I could comment. I was going to mention this earlier, that were at my polling place, which I voted. It didn't take very long at all. I would say 10 minutes, which is, but yeah, there was a lot of, I would say, positive energy. That was what I was getting. I saw a lot of, I was a little surprised that I saw a number of young people working at the polls, quite an age range. And that was something that, yeah, that was encouraging, I guess, to me. As you mentioned, Tony, we have a number of law students, working here with us, and kind of seeing that at the same time, seeing younger people involved in the process, working the polls, that was I guess, uplifting. So yeah, I didn't detect tension or anything like that. I think people were just, yeah, um, fulfilling their duty as citizens, and happy to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I voted pretty early this morning near my home, and the atmosphere was calm and a little bit serious. But that might have been because people hadn't had their morning coffee yet. There were a lot of people who I think had planned to go home and then get ready for work and that sort of thing. But it was calm, it was serious, it was peaceful, lots of neighbors sort of nodding and waving to each other, but everyone seemed to recognize the gravity of what they're about to do. And so there wasn't, the atmosphere was not light. People weren't joking or anything like that. Later in the day, mid-morning, I drove my grandmother to vote at a different polling place. And there, once the sun was up and these were sort of midday voters, lots of families with kids and I think elderly people. And that atmosphere was a little bit more lighthearted as I watched people walk in. They were smiling at each other, saying, "Isn't this a great day? Don't you love voting?" And that's really fun to see.
And I love the Ohio voted stickers and similar stickers that are
Yes.
used in states across the country. Yes, and Anne, you're wearing one.
Yeah,
It's
I think,
great.
and I've seen so many photos of folks voting stickers on social media and that sort of thing. I think as jurisdictions are encouraging people maybe not to take ballot selfies, which is
Mhm.
probably a good thing. That we can agree, and in many states it's actually outlawed. In Ohio, it's outlawed. Having these, photos with your voting stickers really become a bit of a rite of passage.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful thing. And we have the Australian ballot, we have a secret ballot for a reason so that voters can vote in privacy and vote according to their conscience without any coercion being placed on them potentially from the outside. But I love that we celebrate individuals' participation in the voting process through things like the sticker of I voted. In fact, I think Terry's got an Ohio voted sticker as well on, as Ann
Yeah,
does.
and I want to invite Terry to share something about the Franklin County early in-person voting. I know you mentioned that there were some special sounds inside the voting center, and I think those are really cool for those of us who love the franchise.
Yeah, so we're back. Um, small technical glitch there. So I voted early on Sunday, and the window for voting on Sunday was 1 to 5. So I got there about 1:15. The parking lot was full, and there were lines and lines and lines and lines of people, and they had created a whole bunch of switchbacks so that you would think, oh, good, I need to get to there, and then you'd switch back and go reverse your route. And then once you finally got in the building, there were 10 switchbacks. We were in 10 rows, but you could hear what was going on in the room. And so every few minutes, somebody in the room where the voting was actually taking place would yell, first time voter in the house. And then we would all clap and cheer, which was really quite fun.
That sounded really heartwarming.
Can I ask a legal question or pose a legal question? So there have been a number of cases resolved or, adjudicated just in the last week, and of course, many before that as well. And a couple of them in particular raised for me what is kind of a metaphysical question about what it means to cast a vote. Uh, so in Pennsylvania, there's been a question about whether a state statute that says a voter who has voted by a mail-in ballot and whose ballot has been received by the election officials may not vote a provisional ballot. And the question arose, well, what about a voter who uses a mail-in ballot and sends it to the election officials, but the election officials determined that it is not eligible to be counted? And in Pennsylvania, it's hard to know ahead of election day that it's not eligible to be counted because they're not processing the ballots in much detail. But one of the things they can do ahead of election day is determine just by the weight of the envelope that it's missing the secrecy envelope inside. And if it's missing the secrecy envelope, it's not a valid ballot. And because of that, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that voters in that category should be allowed to cast a provisional ballot. And the sort of metaphysical question is, in that circumstance, arguably the voters have not yet cast their ballot or cast their vote because what they've done is not going to be counted. And so the court is giving them an opportunity to cast a vote that still could be counted. Whereas in contrast, in the Fifth Circuit, we had this question about whether voters whose ballot is marked on election day but doesn't get received by the election officials until after election day can be counted or not under the federal law that sets Tuesday as election day. And the Fifth Circuit said, well, the act of voting is not complete until the ballot is received by the election officials. And so their interpretation of federal law is that ballots that come in after election day should not be counted because of the federal election day statute. Now, to be clear, that Fifth Circuit decision is not governing today. I mean, the Fifth Circuit said, we're in the middle of this election. Voters are already relying on the notion that they can get their ballot in after election day as long as it's postmarked by election day. But we think the right understanding of federal law is that if it's not received by the election officers by election day, it should not be counted for federal races. And both of those cases have, raised this question of when has a voter completed the act of voting? And there's a little tension in the arguments on both sides of that question here. And it's a new question for me anyway. I've taken too long about it. I'm just wondering what people think about what it is to cast a ballot as a matter of law.
To me, if the voter has done all of the things that the voter is supposed to do, and it's done by close of polling in their jurisdiction, everything should go on the side of that vote should be able to be counted. So if they, if you put it in the mail in the proper time and it doesn't get there because of the postal service, the voter has still done all the acts that the voter is supposed to do. And if you say it's not counted till it's received, if I'm nefarious, I can come up with all kinds of ways to just not receive a whole mess of votes because I don't want to. But I would err on the side of if the voter's done all the steps, you should work hard to count it.
That's consistent with, this democracy canon that you sometimes see explicitly invoked in adjudicating election issues. And even when it's not explicitly invoked, is sometimes really at play in how courts analyze some of these issues. It's also, I think, akin to something we see in other areas of the law that often is called the mailbox rule, where deadlines are in at least many circumstances met if something's put into the mailbox.
Yeah, of course, the state legislatures could specify in clear terms in the statute, what votes would count and what wouldn't. And maybe we're talking about situations where the language is unclear, where I would agree that leaning into the democracy canon and what Terry said, erring on the side of counting the vote makes a lot of sense to me. But I guess you could only do that so much if the language of the statute is clear that only ones that arrive in time count. Then, well, I'm not sure there's a way around that other than maybe a court interpreting a constitutional provision, saying that was somehow contrary to that.
It's an interesting question who gets to make the decision too. I mean, Terry, and Steve, you've alluded to a democracy canon and the kind of principles we should apply. Certainly this is something a legislature could decide, but it strikes me that legislatures might not be highly motivated to step in and pick this deadline and instead rely on courts. Could we find ourselves in a situation where, depending on where you vote, the arrival of your ballot means something different, right? Mailing it counts in some states, having it arrive and means something else in other states. And that seems like that could be a concerning set of conflicting decisions.
Hey, you
But
really have to know the rules.
Isn't that the status of right now? Right?
Yes.
I mean, Matt, I agree with you that the first step is that the rules need to be clear before the election ever starts as to what it is that the voter's supposed to do and when things need to arrive, etc. But we already have different rules on when things need to arrive between states as it is.
And with respect to the Fifth Circuit decision, which really still strikes me as an outlier and a bit of a surprise, for decades now, many states have accepted ballots that arrive after Election Day, as long as they are postmarked by Election Day or have other indicia that they were marked by Election Day, that the voter had made their irrevocable choices by Election Day. So that's been happening. And in many states, it's been happening because the state legislatures have been clear that in their state, that's appropriate. And the Fifth Circuit decision comes with that background. And it's the Fifth Circuit saying that this 150-year-old statute that sets Election Day as the first Tuesday after the first Monday in election in November means that votes have to be cast, and in the Fifth Circuit's view, somehow taken into the system by that day. And that's really not at all clear from the text of the federal statute that the Fifth Circuit is relying on. It's their interpretation or their construction of that statute, which again runs counter to what, until their decision, really almost everybody had assumed was a reasonable way for states to structure their elections.
The Fifth Circuit ruling, of course, reflects what one U.S. Court of Appeals has held, and the Court of Appeals are organized along geographical lines. So the Fifth Circuit ruling will appeal, will to the extent it survives Supreme Court review, will apply to future elections, federal elections in Texas and Louisiana, and I think Oklahoma might be in the Fifth Circuit as well.
Or
Well,
Mississippi.
today, or Mississippi. Whereas other circuits, until we have a U.S. Supreme Court opinion, might go in a different direction. And we're seeing that play out today in the fact that we've got 50 states who are administering this election, plus the District of Columbia, with different rules for registration, residency requirements, whether felons may vote. And then within those states, we have thousands and thousands of counties and municipalities who are actually conducting the election. So America's the single election of a president of the United States is really 10,000 elections across the country administered under so many different rules. And yet at a certain level, I think that is the magic of American elections and sort of small f federalism, that the local governments, state governments, they play a key role in deciding what the rules are. And those rules may vary even within a single state. And although sometimes that looks like a bug of the system, on the other hand, it could be just a feature that gives us a sort of play in the joints as a democracy to allow local conditions to ultimately dictate, within constitutional restraints, of course, and federal statutory restraints, sort of dictate the parameters of the election. So maybe this is something to celebrate.
I imagine we'll see some more litigation on that issue that the Fifth Circuit dealt with. I'm not aware of anything sort of teed up in other circuits, but that will be interesting to see how that develops and whether the Fifth Circuit will kind of remain an outlier or not.
Sometimes that variation across states is, sort of inscrutable. It's hard to understand and hard to accept, perhaps. At other times, it's much easier to see why a particular state or even a particular county is doing what they're doing. And, one obvious variation between states is the differences between making voting accessible in rural places versus making voting accessible in urban places. And for instance, that difference could well justify having different early voting locations and early voting hours and early voting processes compared to some place with very different housing patterns and densities and so on. But sometimes those variations are harder to explain.
It's a wonderful opportunity to see states. We often talk in law school classes about states as laboratories of democracy and sort of figuring out what solutions might work. These are opportunities to experiment and then with all these different, 50 times however many sub traditions there are within any state, you get all these different experiments, and we, hope the election administrators are learning from great examples of what works well, et cetera, to consistently improve.
Uh, I think the other aspect of this, as Anne said, we have all these laboratories of democracy, not just at the state level, but even at the subunits of government. The other aspect of our elections, I think, in the last 4 years especially, is that we're seeing convergence in that 4 years ago, there is obviously the Republicans were very critical of the idea of mail-in ballots and early voting, and we're not seeing that in 2024. The last time I checked, the early vote split between Republicans and Democrats is just a couple percentage points. And I think you're going to see that in state laws as well going forward. I would predict the trend is going to be to create more opportunities for voters rather than less. And I think the democracy canon is going to be embraced by more courts, especially as appear to be going through a major realignment of the two parties, one that will increasingly require both parties to appeal to all demographics, to all aspects of the American electorate. And that's a really good thing. In a time where Americans are very pessimistic about the future, I think a lot of the um, underlying structural changes in the country and our political system are really positive. And so maybe the democracy canon is just in its early stages and really is going to be embraced across the board in future election cycles by legislatures, red legislatures and blue legislatures.
Tony, I was going to say something similar, just about the embrace of mail-in voting, as well as early in-person voting. And I continue to think that in-person voting is just always going to be somewhat preferable if you don't need the convenience of mailing in a ballot. The early in-person voting means you are assured when you walk out of your polling place that your ballot's then going to be counted. When you drop it in the mail, you don't know yet whether it's going to get there or not. But it does provide quite a bit of convenience. And it really is an example of the states as laboratories of democracy, given the way in which a few states in particular, like Washington and Oregon, championed mail-in voting for all their voters now a number of years ago. And then with COVID, it really was something many other states wanted to take advantage of. And we may not see as much this election as we did in 2020. The jury's still out, I think, in just what the total number of votes that were cast pre-election day will be. The count of the absentee ballots that are mailed in is still happening now. We'll see what the final number is. But the end of this election, I think we all ought to take heart from the participation rate. And as Tony said again at the beginning today, it seems likely already that the turnout level for this election is again high. Whether it's going to exceed 2020, we don't know. But given some of the cynicism about democracy, that's heartening to just see the number of our fellow citizens who continue to value this opportunity to participate. So yay for elections.
I'm curious for everyone, based on the lawsuits that our students have been following and that we've been talking about on the podcast recently, what changes are you expecting to see states undertake after this election is over? Because I'm really thinking of the world and what are we likely to see before the polls close tonight and sort of post this election litigation? And then what changes are we going to see long-term going forward? And I'm curious whether you have any predictions about, besides what we will see develop with the Fifth Circuit and whether it remains an outlier, what else you think we might encounter?
Yeah, I think that's a nice question. And I'm curious what others think as well. I think we're going to continue to see states working to promote additional transparency around their processes. And perhaps as a piece of that,
Hmm.
clarify a little more yet the role of observers in the process. I think that we're likely to see additional attention to the problem of um, sort of deep fakes and manipulation of the voting system through especially artificial intelligence generated sort of false narratives. And that's a tricky thing for states to work to police, but some of those efforts are happening and may continue to happen. Um, and then I'd like to think that we continue to refine the way in which we recruit, train, and um, protect our election workers who have been under tremendous stress. This election, the last election, 2022, they were under great stress. 2020, they were under great stress. 2020, they were under stress pre-election because of COVID, and post-election, they were under stress because of the, unsupportable claims about fraud, some of which involved claims that election workers themselves had misbehaved, had tolerated fraud, or had engaged in fraud. So threats to election workers and um, abuse, some of it, mainly verbal, nonetheless, makes it difficult for them to do their job. And we saw that in 2022, and we've seen it in 2024. And there are a number of efforts, some of them happening in individual states for their election of workers, and others that are more national in terms of providing resources and such, designed to help make election workers more secure, really, in that role. And we continue to depend on them. And so doing things that make it easier for people to serve in that role, I think, are important.
What he said. I'm in Nevada where, just for the semester, where they're doing elections under some new rules for the first time, and they've done some things that sort of expand the franchise. You can go vote. You can pull your ballot at any polling place in the county, so you don't have to just go to one place. They have election that you can register and vote on the same day, on election day. So it's interesting to see that there are states going one direction and states going the other direction in terms of making it easier and making it harder. And I don't know when each of those directions turns around. Like, I don't know when a state that's becoming more open decides to change and close things down, and vice versa. So I don't know whether it's something that happens and an anecdote, causes a reversal, or whether they look to another state and say, wow, it really worked out there, let's try it here. I don't know what causes those movements, but it's something I think is interesting to observe.
One thing I was just going to observe regarding something to look for in terms of election law changes in the future. I think campaign finance, which really hasn't been talked about much in terms of litigation disputes in the last few election cycles, I predict it's going to become front and center again here in Ohio. The U.S. Senate race has cost at least $467 million, 12 million people, $500 million, which reflects how important this is, and money's pouring in from across the country. And the total may end up being more than that because we won't have all the data until later in November. What I would predict is that Democrats in the presidential race have a huge lead over the Republicans. Historically, Republicans always had the advantage. Basically, Abraham Lincoln through George Bush, Republican presidential candidates, Republican congressional candidates had much deeper pockets than the Democrats did. But we've seen now a pretty significant and dramatic change in the last 2 decades. And so I suspect we may see among Republicans more enthusiasm for finding ways to put new restrictions on campaign finance within the confines of recent Supreme Court rulings. So that's one area I think we may end up with a different position taken by the two parties on big campaign finance issues.
Very good. Well, Tony, please keep talking now, because
Okay.
I think we've probably reached the point where we should wrap up, but that includes the answer to last week's trivia question and then a new trivia question.
Yes, absolutely, Steve. So last week's trivia question was, who ran for the Republican nomination 9 times and was a serious candidate for the nomination twice? And the answer is the former governor of my home state, Minnesota, Harold Stassen. Harold Stassen was known as the boy governor of Minnesota. He was a rising political star in the 1930s and 40s. He resigned as governor of Minnesota to serve in the U.S. Navy in World War II. He was a leading candidate for the Republican nomination in 1948 and 52, fell just short of winning the nomination in 48. And of course, in 52, Eisenhower got it. But Harold Stassen had the bug for running for president and just couldn't stop doing it. So he ended up becoming, quite tragically, a punchline for failed, hopeless presidential candidacies. But he was actually a serious candidate early in his career. And next week's trivia question is also about a candidate for office. And that question is this: who is the last Supreme Court justice to have held elected office? Who was the last Supreme Court justice to have held elected office? So look for our next podcast, which could actually be later in the week, may not be next week, could be later this week, to find the answer to that question.
Great. Thanks for those trivia questions for us, Tony. And with that, we'll wrap this episode. Tony and Ann and Matt and Terry, it's great to have been with each of you, and I'll look forward to being with you all again in our next episode coming soon. Thanks, everyone.